Well, we're going to keep things moving. Our next speaker is Rachael Wong, and it's a great privilege to have her here. She's another one I've been chasing for 3 years to get to this conference, and I'm very persistent, but I really appreciate Rachael coming along today. She's another very busy person. Rachael is the Chief Executive Officer of Women's Forum Australia. She is a former New Zealand lawyer. She previously worked with the Law Reform Commission in Samoa to bring about legislative reform to improve the lives of Samoan women and girls, and has worked and volunteered in a range of legal and human rights related roles. Rachael holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Laws honours from the University of Auckland, and a Master of Bioethics and Health from the University of Otago. I've known Rachael for many years and watched her journey and seen her voice raised to prominence in this nation, and she's one of the most fearsome advocates for girls and women, and you're going to enjoy what she has to say today. Please welcome Rachael Wong.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lyle, for that very kind introduction. I was thinking the other day when I'd met Lyle, and he was actually one of the first people I met when I arrived in Sydney in the advocate sort of space, which was back in 2016. So it's been 9 years, which is quite a long time. I really do hope the morning tea break is imminent, because my presentation is also going to be quite heavy, so I apologise in advance for that, but it's difficult when we are dealing with quite a lot of very hard and difficult issues in our culture at the moment. But it really is a privilege to be with you all here today, and it's especially nice to be among friends, to be with those who know what a woman is, and a man for that matter, which is a lot more than I can say of many of our politicians, sadly. Now, before I go any further, I want to be clear that Women's Forum Australia is not aligned with any political party. We don't campaign for candidates or tell people how to vote. What we do is work with anyone in public life across the political spectrum who is willing to stand with us in genuinely defending women's dignity, safety and rights. And sadly, as you'll know, those champions are all far too rare. And that's why I'm incredibly grateful for Family First. Your party has been one of the few voices in the political arena willing to speak truth into difficult issues and willing to endure the backlash that inevitably follows. And that courage is desperately needed if we are to turn the tide on some of the most serious threats facing women and girls in Australia today. Make sure I'm using this correctly. Oh, you went forward and back. That way? There we go. So this morning I want to share with you who we are at Women's Forum Australia, what we mean when we talk about genuinely pro-women cultural change, and how we are putting this vision into action on the front lines of some of the most urgent and contested debates in our nation. So who are we? Women's Forum Australia is a non-partisan, non-religious, independent think tank that undertakes research, education and public policy advocacy on issues affecting women and girls, with a particular focus on addressing behaviours and practices that are harmful and abusive to them. We work and engage with MPs, media and the public, addressing issues such as the sexualisation and objectification of women and girls in media and advertising, violence against women, pornography, prostitution, trafficking, abortion, surrogacy, and the erasure of biological sex. These are, of course, all human issues that affect us all. But the vulnerabilities of women and girls mean they often bear the heaviest burden of harm. And yet, tragically, many of these practices have been championed by women and our culture poisoned by a very toxic version of feminism, which is why it is critical that we can speak into these issues from a women-focused perspective, and that women themselves are at the forefront of challenging these distortions and reclaiming our culture. And this is where Women's Forum Australia comes in. Women's Forum seeks to influence culture and public policy in a way that is genuinely pro-women, and to inform and empower Australians to make a difference for women and girls, their families and communities. So what do I mean by genuinely pro-women? When most people think of feminism or women's advocacy, they often picture what they see in the mainstream media and popular culture. Slogans about choice, caricatures of women pitted against men, and an ideology that tells us that freedom means doing whatever we want, no matter the cost. Mainstream feminism tends to ignore the differences between men and women. It often casts men and women who don't toe the line as the enemy, and it clings to distorted ideas of freedom, equality, and empowerment, often zealously focusing on choice and autonomy without interrogating what's been chosen and the consequences. Our vision at Women's Forum Australia is radically different. We acknowledge and celebrate the distinct nature of women. We happily work alongside men, understanding that many of the cultural issues we're tackling are also harming them. And we recognise that what is truly good for women is good for men, children, and families too. We don't believe that women need to be or to act like men in order to achieve equality. We see freedom and empowerment as more than licence. And we look at the consequences of women's choices, what drives them, and understand that true freedom and empowerment depend on genuine choices that are rooted in truth, dignity, and the flourishing of the human person. That is the standard by which we approach every issue we engage in. And this morning, I want to illustrate what that looks like by speaking about 5 of our key areas where this clash of visions is playing out right now: the erasure of biological sex, abortion, pornography, prostitution, and surrogacy. One of the most urgent and alarming challenges facing women and girls today is the cultural and political push to erase biological sex. For if we can't even define what a woman is, how can we protect and advocate for their needs and rights on any other issue? And as you know, this is not some fringe debate happening on social media. It is a movement that has captured our institutions, shaped government policy, and is rewriting the rules of our everyday lives. Advocates of gender ideology argue that this is about respect and inclusion. But in reality, it is women and girls who are harmed and excluded. When a man who identifies as a woman is housed in a female prison, or a trans-identified male enters an intimate female-only space like a bathroom or a change room, both issues of which we are grappling here within Australia, it is women and girls who pay the price in terms of safety and dignity. When male athletes are allowed to compete in women's sport, it is women and girls who are disadvantaged in competition, put at risk of injury, who lose out on opportunities, and who may even self-exclude as a result. And then there are our children. In Australia, despite a 180-degree turn on this issue overseas, a growing number of young people are being funnelled down a medicalised path of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgeries, interventions that can leave them sterile, sexually dysfunctional, and with lifelong health issues. Young women and girls are massively overrepresented in this group. Far from being empowered, these girls are vulnerable, often struggling with trauma, autism, or social pressures. And instead of receiving the psychological care they desperately need, they have been fast-tracked to irreversible harm. And as we've just heard from Bella, this ideology is also rampant throughout our classrooms. At Women's Forum Australia, we have been active in challenging this ideology. We have published an in-depth research report on protecting women's sport and sent it to every MP and major sporting body throughout the country. We've made submissions to parliamentary inquiries opposing sex self-ID laws and so-called conversion ban laws, run advocacy campaigns calling for urgent action on youth gender medicine and to restore women's sex-based rights, highlighted the scandal of men and women's prisons, called out the threats to free speech and parental rights, platformed detransitioners who courageously share their stories, and defended those being silenced or punished for standing up on these issues. We have also worked with journalists, MPs, and everyday Australians from around the country to bring to light stories on these issues in the media and on the floors of our parliaments. Contrast this with the approach of many so-called women's advocates who cheer on the inclusion of males in female spaces, or push the indoctrination and medical transitioning of children. They call this feminism and gender equality. But a feminism that erases women and fails to protect vulnerable children is no feminism at all. Most incredible and shameful are the number of so-called ministers for women in Labour governments around the country who have sold out women and girls to this ideology. I guess they are following in the footsteps of Julia Gillard, whose government is responsible for significantly eroding women's sex-based rights under the 2013 amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act. Genuinely pro-women advocacy insists that women's sex-based rights are non-negotiable. It insists that our children deserve protection from ideological experimentation. And it insists that truth and biological reality and the ability to speak and defend these matter. Another issue on which we sadly part ways with many women's advocates, some of whom we actually do agree with and work with closely on many other issues, is that of abortion. Mainstream feminist discourse portrays abortion as a woman's right, a woman's choice, and women's healthcare, often couching it in terms of freedom and empowerment. Yet for countless women, abortion is not a free or empowered choice. It is a choice made under duress. Financial hardship, lack of support from partners or family, pressure from employers, non-family friendly social structures, fear of intimate partner violence. Many women describe feeling that they had no other choice. And the tragic reality is that ready access to the band-aid solution of abortion, so that women can effectively be more like men, has removed the incentive for our society to properly support women facing a crisis pregnancy and to provide a humane response to the issues that drive them to seek abortion in the first place. This has in turn fed the lie that abortion is necessary for women's equal participation in society and that children are an obstacle to women's success and flourishing. Far from being liberating, we know that abortion can leave women with physical trauma, deep psychological wounds, regrets, and grief, suffering that our culture often refuses to acknowledge. And of course, abortion also ends the life of an unborn child, a truth that too many abortion advocates go to great lengths to minimise or deny. What's more, it is little girls that bear the brunt of sex-selective abortion, which research shows is prevalent even in some Australian immigrant communities. If we recognise the grave importance of ensuring rights for women and girls based on their biological sex and protections for vulnerable children, then of particular urgency is the targeting of little girls simply because they are girls before they are even born, and the assault on their most basic right to life when they are at their most vulnerable. Across Australia, lawmakers have enshrined some of the most extreme abortion laws in the world, including late-term abortion right up until birth, the removal of safeguards for women, and even provisions that threaten doctors' freedom of conscience. Women's Forum Australia has spoken out consistently against these laws. We've made submissions, spoken at public rallies and in the media, highlighted the risks and harms of abortion, published thought-provoking articles and publications, and advocated for real choice and genuine support and care for women and their unborn children. Contrast this with the approach of some of the most vocal women's rights advocates, who celebrate abortion as a social good and resist even the mildest safeguards, like parental notification for minors, bans on sex-selective abortion, or requirements for informed consent, insisting that it is always and everywhere empowering. But a culture that leaves women with no better option than to end the life of their child is not a culture that honours women. The reality is that abortion is not and has never been in the best interests of women. It is counterproductive to women's health and welfare and betrays the basic feminist principles of non-discrimination, non-violence, and justice for all. Genuinely pro-women advocacy means working to build a culture where no woman feels that she has to choose between her child and her future. It means supporting women in crisis pregnancies and ensuring our laws reflect both compassion for mothers and protection for their unborn children. Pornography is another issue where the mainstream narrative of choice and empowerment obscures the truth. Porn is so often sold to us as harmless entertainment, even a tool for liberation. But the reality is that the porn industry thrives off the exploitation of women and girls, and its effects are deeply corrosive to relationships, mental health, and society at large. It is without a doubt one of the most destructive forces in our culture today. Studies show skyrocketing rates of porn use among children and adolescents, shaping their understanding of sex in ways that are violent, degrading, and completely divorced from love or intimacy. Young women report feeling pressured to perform acts that they have seen in porn. And the industry itself is rife with coercion, trafficking, and abuse. Meanwhile, the rise of platforms like OnlyFans and its proliferation through mainstream and social media are compounding porn's harms and reach and promoting and glamorising the porn-style lifestyle to impressionable young girls. At Women's Forum Australia, we have worked to expose the harms of porn, highlighted the links between porn consumption and violence against women, advocated for stronger measures to protect children online, and called out major corporations who promote or profit from sexual exploitation. Yet many feminist voices defend women's involvement in porn as work and as a woman's choice, and an empowering choice at that. They insist that those who criticise porn are prudish or anti-sex. But this is not about prudishness. It is about the dignity and well-being, not only of women, but of children and men, and the flourishing of our society as a whole. A genuinely pro-women perspective recognises that porn does not liberate women. It profits from their abuse and feeds violence against them, distorts men's perception of women, sex and relationships, and robs children of their innocence. Closely linked to pornography is prostitution. Once again, the mainstream feminist narrative frames it as sex work, a job like any other, and that women should be free to choose this career path, which is empowering. But in what other line of work is violence, trauma, coercion, and degradation part of the job description? Most women in prostitution are not there because they freely chose it. They are there because of poverty, childhood abuse, grooming, addiction, coercion, or some other disadvantage or trauma. The choice is illusory. And even in supposedly regulated environments, violence is endemic. Shamefully, prostitution has largely been deregulated, decriminalised, or at least legalised in some form in states and territories across Australia, in line with the distorted idea that it is work, or just like any other job. The truth, however, is that prostitution is nothing like any other job. It is an inherently exploitative, violent, dehumanising industry and an abhorrent form of sexual exploitation. Other countries have recognised this and have introduced truly progressive, pro-women laws based on the highly effective Nordic model, which is what Women's Forum has been advocating for in Australia. The Nordic model decriminalises those selling sex, recognising them as victims of exploitation, while holding pimps, brothel owners, and sex buyers accountable. This approach has been shown in countries like Sweden and Norway to reduce demand and provide pathways for women out of the industry. Last year we ran events highlighting the harms of prostitution in Sydney and Adelaide and supported Liberal MLC Nicola Centofanti in South Australia in her introduction of Nordic model style bills, the first of their kind in Australia. While both bills unfortunately failed, one only lost by one vote, which, while frustrating, is also incredibly encouraging. We are hoping that a win on this issue in South Australia, which has rejected decriminalisation 13 times, could pave the way for Nordic model reform throughout the country. By contrast, mainstream feminists often ally themselves with pimps and brothel owners in the name of workers and women's rights. But prostituted women themselves, when they're free to speak honestly, overwhelmingly describe prostitution as harmful, not empowering. A genuinely pro-woman approach means working for a society where no woman is commodified, bought and sold. It means addressing the root causes that drive women into prostitution and building real exit strategies and support. We cannot end violence against women while the violent commodification of women's bodies is promoted by our governments as work. Finally, let us consider surrogacy, another form of commodification often framed in terms of work and choice. In reality, surrogacy reduces women to wombs for hire and children as products to be acquired. It exploits women's economic vulnerability and fractures the natural bond between mother and child. In Australia, commercial surrogacy is currently illegal, but so-called altruistic surrogacy is permitted. The reality, however, is that law enforcement turns a blind eye to Australians who travel overseas to engage in commercial surrogacy arrangements. This is despite horrendous stories of clinics in countries like Greece, where a couple of years ago it was revealed that at least 98 women had been trafficked into surrogacy slavery. Around half the clientele for that clinic were Australians. And then, of course, there are the tragic stories of children who were left behind when they failed to meet expectations, which is what happens when we're talking about a product, including by Australians in countries like Ukraine and Thailand. Here at home, there is increasing pressure to liberalise surrogacy laws. The Australian Law Reform Commission is currently undertaking a review, which is blatantly biased towards expanding the practice of surrogacy. And next week, debate will begin on a bill by the Western Australian Labor government to do the same. Last year, under the guise of equality, the New South Wales Labor government also effectively rubber-stamped overseas commercial surrogacy by creating a pathway for parentage orders for children born of such arrangements. What is especially disturbing is how pro-surrogacy advocates always try to couch their reforms in terms of the best interests of the child, when the reality is that it is never in a child's best interest to be deliberately separated from its birth mother, who is sometimes also its biological mother. Women's Forum Australia has been a consistent voice against pushes to expand the practice of surrogacy in Australia. We have made submissions on bills and to surrogacy law reviews, have written extensively about the harms and health risks of surrogacy to women and children, and advocated for Australia to follow countries like France, Italy and Spain, who have enacted total bans on all forms of surrogacy, on the basis that it violates the dignity and rights of women and children. We argue that the problem with surrogacy in Australia, altruistic or commercial, is not that it is unregulated or unavailable. The issue with surrogacy is that it is, in and of itself, unethical. The exploitation, commodification and harm done to women and children is breathtaking, and no amount of regulation is going to change that. Mainstream feminists, however, often embrace surrogacy not only as work, but as a practice necessary to promote equality for those who can't have children. Yes, we must have compassion for such people, and I think, for example, that much more needs to be done to address the rising issues of infertility. But there is no right to a child, and there is no right to a woman's body to get one. A genuinely pro-woman approach recognises that adult desires, no matter how noble or genuine, cannot come at the cost of harming and commodifying and exploiting women and children. At Women's Forum Australia, we're committed to advancing cultural and policy change that genuinely serves women and girls. And we are deeply encouraged to see parties like Family First taking a strong stand on these issues, refusing to be cowed by political correctness or ideological bullying. Like Bella, I want to acknowledge in particular the leadership of Lyle Shelton, who has consistently and courageously spoken up on behalf of women, children and families, even when it has come at great personal cost. Friends, the challenges before us are great. The forces against truth, against women, and against the family are powerful. But we also know that courage is contagious, and that when people of conviction work together, change is possible. I hope that you can take from this presentation a renewed commitment to stand for truth, to defend women and children from harm and exploitation, and to build a culture that honours the dignity of every human person. That is what it means to be genuinely pro-women, and that is the future that we at Women's Forum Australia will continue to fight for. Thank you.